So maybe you know someone who's dyslexic and they get time and a half accommodations on their tests. Sounds pretty awesome, right? Who wouldn't want that? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Hey everyone, we're Nick and Sonia, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we want to cover how accommodations, while they can be really, really important, aren't sometimes as glamorous as they might appear, or as sort of easeful, I guess, as they might appear.
Right. Their accommodations, as we discussed in a recent episode, are very important for your dyslexic kids. So I don't want anyone to take this episode as discouraging people from seeking out appropriate accommodations. But this is kind of more of a public service announcement kind of thing where there are some downsides. And so it's important for everyone to understand that they aren't really as glamorous as you might think, as Sonia said.
Yeah, and often we focus just on, the idea and understanding that it's an issue of equity, where if someone thinks it might be unfair, that it's an issue of equity to try to, bring someone up to having the same access. But in this case, we're actually going to be talking about some of the downsides, so you can really see how it plays out in real life.
Yeah, and so the first and kind of primary accommodation that we're going to be discussing today is extra time on tests, because this is one of the most common accommodations for dyslexia. It's one of the most important, in our opinion, but it has some downsides. And so if you think about it, I guess the best way to phrase this is if you have more time to take your tests, it means you're going to be spending more time taking tests.
Right. And so we'll break that down a little bit for you so you can see how that might be a difficult thing in certain ways too.
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, as we've discussed before, and as many of you are aware, it takes a lot of energy and mental effort for dyslexic kids to focus. And so when dyslexic kids are taking a test, and when they're really, really focused on taking that test, and if they're really on, that takes so much mental energy that it's hard for them to focus for a standard maybe hour test. And so by adding the extra time, which is probably necessary for them in order to process all the written material in the test, it does mean that they have to focus for perhaps 50% more, perhaps double time, depending on what their accommodation is. So really, if you think about it, we are giving the dyslexic kid the accommodation of more time, but we're actually asking them to do more mental effort by focusing for longer, for an hour and a half or 2 hours instead of an hour, which can be quite challenging.
Right. And so I think anyone can imagine too that if they're losing focus on the test, that also means that yes, you're getting the extra time, which might help you, but the fact that your focus is becoming, not as good can actually harm how well you do on the test. So it's this balance sort of between how long you're taking and how long a dyslexic kid or anyone can focus, and the fact that the extra time is needed.
Yeah, exactly. And one might say, oh, well, they should just break it up. They can do half one day and half the next. And the problem with that is that most teachers are going to be very reluctant to do that because they're going to be worried about cheating. They're going to be worried you're going to go home and look up the answers or whatever, and then come back the next day. So that would be better, but most teachers are just not going to allow that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so here, let's talk about a specific example of this that is an extra extreme case because it's a long test anyway. So if you're taking more like a standardized test, usually, let's say it's an AP test or the SATs, an AP test usually is around 3 hours. And so a time and a half, which is the most common time accommodation, would mean that it's 4.5 hours of testing. So already you can see that gets to be really long, especially for an already long test, just in the way we just talked about, which is in terms of focus. But if I break that down even further, I think what you might not realize is, so there's different sections of the test, for example. And so it'll take even longer than 4.5 hours, so maybe closer to 5, that someone's actually in the testing area, because they have to do you at the beginning have to do the thing where you're filling out all the bubbles with the information, and then you do take brief breaks between sections. And so maybe it ends up being more closer to 5 hours. And then you also, unfortunately, it's not like you can, just do all the sections. And so then it's actually less time, and sure, you have to stay there, but you're sitting there and you're done at the end. It won't work that way, because there is the break after each section. So unfortunately, it's really by that like third section where the focus will probably have been lost.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't have dyslexia, and, but I am a computer programmer in my day job. And like, I can't sit there and focus for 5 hours on my work without like a lunch break or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so expecting anyone to do this, let alone a dyslexic kid who, as we just mentioned,
Yeah.
it takes extra mental effort, so much mental effort to focus. Like, to expect someone to be able to do that for 5 hours is just not a recipe for success.
Well, yeah, and the breaks are not such that you can really eat or anything like that either. So we've got that factor added in there too. So longer, can be really, really quite challenging. So
yeah.
Yeah.
So the second like really big problem with extra time on tests is that the school system is not set up well for this. So usually a test will be, and I'm talking about middle school and high school here. Elementary school is a little bit easier because it's a little bit more flexible. But when you have kind of separate classes where each class is an hour or an hour and a half, if you have kind of a block schedule, the tests are usually meant to be done in one class period. And so if you're taking extra time, it's going to take longer than one class period. And so what do? You have to either miss your next class, you have to miss lunch, maybe you have to stay after school, come before school. There are options, but none of them are great. So if you miss another class, then you have work to make up for that class, and then you get behind in that class. And as we've discussed before, again, that's harder for dyslexic kids, especially if your dyslexic kid learns better orally and learns better by actually being in class. Like, missing class is going to be kind of detrimental there.
Right.
And then if you miss lunch, or if you have to stay after school, then you're missing social time, you're missing activity time, you're missing downtime. It's just all around negative, really.
Yeah, and just to mention college, because I don't know how it is at every single college, but from the personal examples that we've heard, it's a problem there too, because often you go to a particular center to take the test, and it's often at a different time than the exam's actually given. So again, scheduling gets really tricky, because it might be at the same time as you have another class or something you're supposed to be attending.
Yeah, often in college, they'll make you, if you have accommodations for extra time or whatever, they make you do it earlier than the rest of the class does it.
Right.
They're worried about cheating again. And so it's just a hassle all around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so another way that this figures in is sort of the challenge of scheduling, right? This is an extra work to actually figure out and do.
Okay, so this goes to the systemic problem again, where there isn't a system in place for kids to get extra time just kind of automatically. So your dyslexic kid is going to have to arrange with their teacher for every different teacher, for every different test. They're going to have to arrange, when do I take the test, when and so on, right? So it's again that extra mental overhead, that extra just work they have to do. And then if your dyslexic kid also has ADHD or any of other kinds of issues that makes it more difficult for them to be organized and to remember things, then that's going to be like an extra hurdle there as well.
Yeah. And so, in this video, we're not going to really get into potential solutions to this, but I do think it's possible, just even starting to think about it. Of course, it would require a lot of change in how scheduling works, but, maybe you'd have specific exam weeks always, and you'd do more exams at those times, like not just during finals, and you'd always make the exam period longer for everyone. And then you'd make sure it's something you know how sometimes there's activities that are like fun but not essential, you know, that could happen for the other students when they're done. I mean, it's obviously not going to be perfect and it would take a lot more thinking out, but it is possible. It's just that when things are done a certain way, it does get very hard to change it. So that is the biggest hurdle, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to reframe this a little bit, in that this shouldn't be your dyslexic kid's problem. This is a systemic problem. But the chances of the system changing anytime soon are, I think, unfortunately pretty small. So it's something that your dyslexic kids do have to deal with.
Yeah, and we're going to talk in a video really soon about sort of this trade-off and how to think about it. You know, there's no perfect answer, but like when to consider like not even maybe using an accommodation, even though it's very important to use them at the same time.
Yeah.
But to go onward to, there's a couple more things still that like for the time being longer, for time and a half, for example, still are difficult. So sometimes there's group tests, and this is something usually everyone's like, oh, it's so wonderful, right? You have a group test, like some, you know, in theory, you're sort of like, you know, someone knows one piece of it and the other person is stronger than the other. And so usually people's grades go up, right, when they have a group test. Well, group tests are very, very difficult when a group member has the extra time. Because, you know, it just doesn't really work with that system.
Right. Mm-hmm. And not to mention that the group tests are, you know, that if your dyslexic kid is slower at reading, like, they're going to have a harder time maybe even keeping up if people are trying to do it in the compressed time. So then they might not feel as if they're contributing as much, because they really should have longer.
Right. And so even though there's the benefit of the other people helping out, you know, let's say they don't have the extra time. So it's pretty much ends up being a choice. They either decide to take it alone and have their extra time, and maybe feel like it flows better, the timing, if they felt like they couldn't contribute, or they do the group test and that boosts them. But then there's these other challenges that go along with it, like you just mentioned.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one last problem that we thought of regarding extra time on tests is that when you're taking it at a separate time, or when you're taking longer, the teacher is not always going to be available to answer questions. So if you're going into another class, the teacher's going to be teaching that other class. They're not going to be available to help you. If you're doing it during lunch, the teacher, you know, depending on the schedule, might be teaching a different class, might be at lunch. I mean, so there's, and then the location too. Sometimes, like, our daughter ends up just like sitting out in the hallway sometimes taking these tests, and then gets distracted by people walking by and whatnot.
Usually for the standardized test, because that is more planned, it is a pretty good location, though. I will say. So that's helpful.
True. But for the regular daily
for just
tests,
like extra time for more regular tests.
Like, there was a math test she took recently where she said she was out in the hallway and she just, for the you know, last part of the test, with the extra time, she just couldn't focus at all because people were walking by and talking to her. And I mean,
it can be pretty difficult.
Yeah.
And then, and to go back again to the asking teachers questions, that's going to vary in terms of how much it affects each individual student. But, you know, in general, dyslexic kids need to ask more questions. So again, it's like this trade-off for like something that is a different kind of accommodation, if you will, or just a standard thing that they use more of in asking, you know, questions about the test.
Yeah.
So, all right. So that was mainly all around increased time as an accommodation, increased time for testing. There's just a few other pieces we wanted to bring in about accommodations in general and why they are not as glamorous as they might seem.
Yeah. So the first one, we kind of touched on this already, is that they never happen automatically. So as with asking for extra time on your test for every test, you kind of have to remind your teacher every time, like, oh, okay, I get to, you know, type this essay, or I don't have to read aloud in class, or I get to pre-record my presentations. It kind of has to be arranged each time with each teacher.
Yeah, and I mean, that again would be probably less true in elementary school where you have the one main teacher, but it really is understandable, like at the other levels, because teachers have so many students when they have multiple classes and they're quite big classes. So it just is kind of a fact, like there are only human. They can't, it's hard
Yeah.
for them to keep track of all that. So, and it is a good thing actually for a student to learn advocacy in that way. However, it's still kind of almost mental, emotional work to do it.
Right. And it's hard to, it's just frustrating when the kind of, like, yes, it's important for kids to learn self-advocacy, but when it's lumped in with the stress of managing your classes and worrying about your grades and stuff, it just becomes an extra added layer of stress.
Right. And then this may be the time to segue into the fact that there's a lot of teachers too who try to encourage like seeing if you can do it in the smaller space of time. And it's well-meaning. It's sort of this idea that maybe you can get better and better at it, which, I mean, really isn't fundamentally understanding the accommodation, but because it's, something that's going to be with the person forever.
Yeah.
But maybe there'd be some incremental change. If you took a test every day, maybe you'd get a little faster. I don't know, or maybe not. But mainly, I think hopefully you can see that is difficult because it's like you're trying to advocate and you're getting resistance, and so then it's a whole other problem.
I mean, this starts as early as elementary school, where a teacher might say, okay, are you ready to read that book in front of the class today? The next day, okay, you want to try reading, and where for most kids it's better to just wait until they feel comfortable and they sort of volunteer to do it.
Or sometimes teachers seem to have a misimpression that in college things will be different, so they're trying to prepare the student, but maybe not understanding that the accommodations are going to also be in college too. So, yeah.
Or for standardized tests too. A lot of
Right.
teachers, surprisingly, a lot of teachers don't seem to understand that you can get like extra time on standardized tests as well.
Or maybe they're already realizing that it's so long.
Yeah.
I mean, that's possible too, actually.
Yeah.
I guess I'm making the assumption maybe they're thinking ahead, like, oh my gosh, a 5-hour test, wouldn't it be better if you could do it faster?
I mean,
but,
yes, but
yeah, but it just doesn't work that way, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, and so the other kind of general problem with accommodations, well, this may or may not be a problem depending on your particular kid, but it does make you stand out. And so for anyone who's sensitive about their learning difference, or for anyone who is worried about being teased, or who has been teased in the past, has some trauma around that, perhaps, like, they're going to stand out. So if you're taking extra time on a test, everyone's going to see that you're taking extra time on the test. Like if you're not reading out loud in front of the class, kids are going to notice you're not reading out loud in front of the class. And this can be a problem at any level, any age. Young kids in early elementary school can be sensitive to teasing and feeling different. Kids in college can be sensitive to feeling different, right? I mean, it's not specific to any age, and it requires a certain level of self-confidence to be able to just kind of do what you need to do there, without worrying or without being discouraged by what your peers might think or say.
Right. And I mean, this does actually bring back in the fairness and equity thing again, because sometimes that's just a more general kind of self-confidence about being different. But I think sometimes there is that perception like that it's not fair. Yeah. And so, and I mean, so the typical thinking, right, would be, which is technically true, that like any on tests, especially like if people are time pressured, that anyone would do better with more time, right? But there's still this other factor that I think is hard sometimes for people to understand, and that other students might not understand, which is that we're still trying to get the equity level the same. So even for a dyslexic, so just to run through it, for a dyslexic student at time and a half, they're still going to feel time pressured, right? Because if you need the extra time, it's like, to what level are they feeling? I mean, I would prefer, we've talked about this before, we'd prefer that no one feels time pressured on tests, because that's not a good measure of people's learning. But given that there is the time pressure, it'd be more like you're trying to have roughly a similar level of the time pressure feeling for each of them to bring them up to the equity.
Yeah, that's a really good a way to explain it. And I think this can get especially hard, though, when you get into high school and college, where tests are sometimes curved. So, the score that every person gets on the test affects the eventual grade of everyone in the class.
Right. So it's like your scores relate to each other.
And so you can see how someone who doesn't have dyslexia, who doesn't have accommodations, is going to look at this and say, well, wait, this isn't fair. And if you do better on this test, like that's going to bring up the curve for everyone, right?
Which means that, so effectively, let's say someone didn't do well on a test, and it and the dyslexic kid did pretty well because they, we had the equity of, and they should have done well because they needed that extra time. But in the way it works with the curving, it essentially means that if the dyslexic kid had done worse, the other student would have done better with the way the curving works.
Right. So you can see how you might get some pushback from other kids.
Yeah. All right. And then just a couple of specific examples of other kinds of accommodations, just a couple for this particular video, and how they might not be as glamorous as they seem. So for example, one kind of accommodation can be to pre-record a presentation. If a dyslexic kid has more challenges with, trying to look at some notes and go back and forth with looking at the notes, as the reminder for what they're supposed to say, like you're allowed some notes. So sometimes pre-recording is one way that is accommodated. But it's actually a lot of work. It can be a lot of work to pre-record the presentation. It is a slightly different thing in a way, in the sense that it sort of is more like, because you're doing it ahead, it's like a little more perfect, I guess, in the sense it's like you feel like you're really like trying to say each thing exactly well. It's a little less extemporaneous. That just automatically happens when you're speaking the other way. And so it usually takes a lot more time to prepare.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Not to mention technology, right? You have to, sometimes that's easy for kids, especially if they've done it for a while, but you have to
know how to
technology
record
and
yourself,
figure it out.
Yeah.
And
Okay, well, it almost wraps it up. We do have one other point that we thought of that can make accommodations more difficult. And this is if you, for example, have an accommodation of listening to audiobooks, or having someone read it to you. You may not have that available when you're in class. And so if you're given class time, say, to read the book you're supposed to be reading, maybe you might not be allowed, maybe you listen to audiobooks on your phone, but you're not allowed to have your phone in class. So you have to wait until you get home, or maybe your parents read it to you. So you have to wait until you get home to listen to your audiobook, or to have your parents, one of your parents, read the book to you. And so you've wasted that time in class, and then you have to do extra work at home to make up for it.
And I would say it's something true in general, that it's harder for dyslexic kid to make use of class time. I guess that's a little beyond just it being about an accommodation, but it's just it's just more difficult to use the time they're given in class for various reasons. But sometimes that relates actually to the accommodations that are needed.
Yeah, exactly.
So hopefully this was helpful. So that if you know someone dyslexic, or maybe you'll feel seen if you are someone who's dyslexic, that it's just not as cushy, not as glamorous as it seems with the accommodations. It really is this equity issue. And there's actually, unfortunately, drawbacks to it too, and trade-offs to having accommodations.
Yeah, with that said, obviously we are strong believers in accommodations for dyslexia. If you have a dyslexic kid, or if you are dyslexic yourself, definitely seek them out. This is more, like we said, educational for kind of everybody else. Like, it's not as glamorous as you might think. But share your experiences with us. We'd love to hear them. Put some comments on YouTube, or message us on the podcast, and let us know what you think.